Hello, I'm Kay Ball. I'm the President of the Murchison District Historical Society, and I'm going to be talking about the World War II internment and prisoner of war camps that were here in the Goulburn Valley. Broadly speaking, this story is not well known at all, and certainly the younger generation and people coming to this part of the Goulburn Valley, perhaps from Melbourne or other parts more recently, are often quite surprised to hear about this local, significant Australian wartime history. So this documentary is going to give an overview of the camp history to those not familiar with the story, but also share some not so well-known stories for those local people they've grown up with this knowledge of the camps, but there are some surprises still to be heard. Today we would probably call them detention centres rather than camps. And here in central Victoria, apart from Dunera Mansion, they were purpose-built facilities. The land was compulsorily required from the local farmer, and the compounds were laid out in the style of a military camp, surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards 24 hours a day. The inmates were not free to leave unless in an organised work party under armed guard supervision. And some of the people were detained here for nearly 7 years. From the outbreak of World War II in 1939, camps were set up all around Australia. In Victoria, apart from Camp at Myrtleford, they were situated around the Waranga Basin, west of Shepparton, and near Nagambie at Greytown. This cluster was referred to as the Tatura group, although the camps were some distance from the town itself. At the time, Camp 3 and 4 were in the Shire of Waranga, that is now Shire of Campaspe. Camp 1, 2 and 13 and Dunera Mansion were in what was then the Shire of Rodney, but that's now City of Greater Shepparton. Greytown Camp was in Goulburn Shire. Today, that's Strathbogie Shire. Greytown was commonly called Camp 6, but Army records refer to it as Greytown No. 6 Labor Detachment, No. 13 POW Group, because it was officially just an outpost of Camp 13. And Dunera Mansion was also an outpost administered from Camp 13, so it didn't have a number. There were two distinct groups of people imprisoned. The first group were civilians or internees, sometimes called enemy aliens, people from German, Italian and Japanese ancestry, and they were seen as a threat to our security, living in Australia when war was declared. And there was also internees brought from Australia from overseas. The second group were prisoners of war. Now these were members of the military. They were soldiers, sailors and airmen who had taken up arms against Australia and the Allied forces, and they had surrendered or were taken prisoner, as well as captured merchant navy and had been transported to Australia. The two groups were managed differently in regard to work. Prisoners of war could be made to work, whereas the internees could not be forced to work and had to be paid for any work that they did undertake. As they were all placed behind barbed wire and guarded, the differences became blurred, and either group can be labelled as prisoners of war or internees, even in official army records. Civilian internees or enemy aliens who were living in Victoria at the outbreak of war in 1939 were initially placed under guard in Dunera Mansion. Camp 1 housed German and Italian internees relocated from Dunera Mansion as conditions were not satisfactory there and numbers were growing. Here is a view of typical huts that housed the internees and prisoners of war on Camp 1, but they're typical of all of the camps. A fully equipped hospital was also on this site, and that serviced all the other camps. Camp 2 at different times held German, Jewish internees, Italian and German prisoners of war. There was often a lot of traffic of the prisoners between one camp and the other. Camp 3 was for family groups, Italians and Germans from Iran, Palestine and the Strait settlements, now Singapore and Malaysia. There were also some Jewish families as well as single women there. Camp 4 was initially used to accommodate Europeans who'd been living in Australia at the outbreak of war. They included Germans, Italians, Hungarians, Finns and Romanians. And after Japan entered the war in 1941, the Europeans were relocated to make way for Japanese internees from Australia, Java and New Caledonia. Included among these were Chinese from Formosa, now Taiwan. So there was a wide range of nationalities. Camp 13, the largest camp in Australia, held German and Italian prisoners of war, and they were all members of the military and merchant seamen. Durrangall Mansion, left vacant when internees were transferred to Camp 1, housed the German officers. Many were survivors of the German ship Cormoran that engaged and sank the Australian cruiser HMAS Sydney off the coast of Western Australia and were brought to Camp 13, and later they were relocated to Greytown. After the sad incident of the outbreak at Cowra in New South Wales, when over 250 Japanese and 4 Australian soldiers died, the Japanese prisoners of war also came to Camp 13. Apart from Durrangall Mansion, the accommodation was in corrugated iron huts, mostly unlined, very hot in summer and freezing in winter, and many of the windows had no glass. Often people ask, why did these people end up in Australia? It was because Britain couldn't cope with the growing number of internees and prisoners of war, particularly those captured by the Allies in North Africa. An official cablegram from North Africa at the time stated there are about 145,000 prisoners, and the figures are still growing. These photos convey the huge number of prisoners involved. Transport, housing, feeding, security, sanitation and medical care became major headaches. Commonwealth countries, India, Canada, Australia and South Africa, were requested by Britain to accept these people. The South African experience is very impressive. 67,000 prisoners of war were sent there. Even though on the same continent, moving this number of prisoners from the north to South Africa can't have been an easy task. The main camp at Zonderwater accommodated 63,000 with a hospital of 1,600 beds. Camp 13 in Murchison accommodated 4,000 prisoners, and that was considered very large by Australian standards. So Australia agreed to accept 50,000 from overseas, but it didn't ever reach this figure. A total of 25,720 prisoners of war were brought to Australian shores. They consisted of more than 18,000 Italians, over 5,000 Japanese, and 1,600 Germans. Civilian internees shipped to Australia numbered about 8,000, and coupled with those interned who were living in Australia when war was declared, the number of internees peaked at 12,000 by 1942. The practicality of shipping these people was very risky. Notably, the sinking of the Arandora Star, carrying prisoners of war and internees from England, with the loss of over 800 lives, was a terrible tragedy. The story of Dunera
another ship used to transport Italian and German POWs and internees, was a scandalous and wretched episode. The ship was grossly overcrowded. Conditions on board were appalling, with the guards treating their passengers with severe cruelty and utter contempt, thus earning that ship its name of the Hell Ship. There is an intriguing and little-known aspect of the journey of the Dunera. The second day after sailing, a German submarine fired 2 torpedoes at the ship, but unsuccessful in damaging their target. When the commander of that U-boat looked through his periscope and saw what he thought were people jumping from the ship, he assumed a mutiny had occurred on board. Under cover of darkness, the submarine surfaced and crew ventured out in rubber dinghies to rescue any survivors. What they found instead were suitcases floating in the sea that the guards on board the Dunera had callously ransacked of treasured possessions, valuable documents, and tossed overboard. When investigating the contents, they found letters written in German addressed to detention camps on English soil. Realising the Dunera's passengers were German POWs and internees, a message was sent to U-boats in the area to allow the ship a safe passage. Because of this rather bizarre twist of circumstances, 2,500 passengers and more than 300 crew and guards on the Dunera were spared suffering a similar fate to those aboard the Andorra Star that had incurred such a terrible loss of life when torpedoed. The excellent water supply from the Waranga Basin was the most important factor in the choice of the siting of the camps in the Goulburn Valley. That and the relative isolation, a long way from ports where ships would offer a means of escape, availability of rail services for transporting internees, prisoners, guards and needed supplies another reason, and it was a food growing area that could supply the camps. The people in these camps kept themselves well occupied. Accommodation, food and clothing were provided, but the detainees had to be self-governing and attend to their own daily living needs.
Leaders were appointed and camps ran on very orderly lines. They organised things such as sporting activities, educational, theatrical and musical groups. They had workshops, produced newspapers, created flower and vegetable gardens. Some even ran small businesses such as hair cutting and tailoring. The children attended school and babies were born to intern parents. Prisoners of war in Camp 13 Murchison and Greytown cut many thousands of tonnes of firewood. Large tomato crops were produced that supplied the camps as well as Melbourne markets. By early 1941, the era of imprisoning those who had been living in Australia and labelled as enemy aliens was realised, as many were hard-working migrants contributing to Australian prosperity, often had been naturalised, and they even had sons serving in Allied forces overseas. Of particular injustice was the imprisonment of the Jewish civilians that had escaped Nazi persecution in Europe to a supposedly safe haven in Britain, only to be rounded up and ended up behind wire in far-flung British colonies. So the process of releasing them began during 1941, and many internees had been released before the end of the war. Some chose to return to Britain, risking a very hazardous sea voyage, and indeed 2 ships on their way to Britain with internees on board were sunk by German U-boats. In need of a local workforce, the Australian Army formed the 8th Employment Company, and many who joined this workforce were sent throughout the Goulburn Valley to pick fruit. After hostilities ceased, internees of British or European origin were permitted, if they wished, to remain in Australia, including those who had been brought from overseas by British authorities. Most internees of Japanese origin were repatriated to Japan, including some who were Australian born, had never been to Japan or spoke the language. Once the internment camps were no longer needed, buildings and equipment were sold by auction and the sites returned to farmland again. Even though the war had ended in 1945, most of the prisoners of war from Camp 13 did not leave until January 1947, and that was due to the shortage of ships to transport them to their homelands. In February 1948, State Rivers and Water Supply Commission took over the site and renovated the buildings to house workers constructing the Tatura Canal. The recreation hall had already been located to Murchison as the local RSL hall and venue for community functions. The well-known murals painted on the inside walls of that building are still in the township of Murchison today.
By 1960, the buildings that were left were sold and removed to be used in various ways, such as scout halls, storage sheds, and seasonal workers' accommodation, and they can still be seen on farms in the region today. There were many interesting stories about the prisoners and internees following the war. These couple of tales are worth relating. One internee, a German, Fritz Lowenstein, who came here on the Dunera, made a significant contribution to post-war Australia. Fritz, who simplified his name to Fred Lowen, was released in 1942 to work as a lathe operator. He began his own wood-turning business and later, with his friend Ernest Rodek, whom he'd met in camp at Tatura, started the Fleur Furniture Company, a name they made up from their initials, FL and ER. By the mid-1960s, Fleur factories were located throughout Australia. Their Scandinavian-style Fleur furniture could be found in many Australian homes and offices and won international awards for outstanding design. Fred also founded the very successful Tessa Furniture Company, and these two brand names are still today highly regarded and sought after furniture pieces.
Fred was awarded the Order of Australia Medal in 1993. People who spent time in these camps often related that they were very well treated and respected by their guards, even described the situation like living in a holiday camp. In 1974, Murchison RSL hosted a reunion, a group of German ex-POWs, and they presented this commemorative plate. The inscription reads, "With thanks to our Australian friends from the former German POWs." There was no discomfort as ex-prisoners and former guards spent time reminiscing about their years at Camp 13. There were, however, many escapes. German prisoners of war in particular were keen to break out, and the newspapers at the time seemed to carry a report of escapes every week or two. They were usually recaptured within a few days. An account written by Gerard Stolt of his escape from Camp 13 is quite amazing. When outside the compound on a working party, and while the guards were having lunch, he and a friend simply walked away. Guarding was often reported as fairly relaxed, as this cartoon by von Gruenwald conveys. The two men walked to Murchison East Railway Station, then south towards Melbourne. Not long after, a police car drew up and they were questioned and asked for identity papers. Of course, they had no papers at all, but made up a story about being Dutchmen who had been fighting with the British in Java. The police gave them a lift into Ngambia Police Station, where they faced further questioning. And while they were there, an officer from Camp 13 arrived. Fortunately, he didn't recognise them, and they kept making up stories that convinced everyone they were Dutch, and succeeded to the point that they were given a letter of introduction to help with any further challenges by the authorities, and also a letter for the Dutch consul in Melbourne. In Melbourne, they booked into the Federal Hotel for the night, even though they were rather scruffily dressed, but obviously not in the maroon dyed clothes issued to prisoners of war. Over the next 5 days, and using their police-issued letters, survived even more questioning. They walked and hitched rides all the way to Ararat, a distance of over 250 kilometres, where they got work cutting wood. A meeting with the local police sergeant, however, was their undoing when he suspected they were 2 German escapees from Camp 13, and they realised the game was up. So they were returned to Camp 13 under police guard, happy after 6 days of freedom, described enjoying some excellent meals and a fair amount of beer, and considered the outing a great holiday. What wasn't mentioned in the account by Stott was that the recording in the Army records states that the episode earned them 28 days in detention, cooped up in the solitary confinement cells that still exist on the site. Today, the sites of all the camps are in private hands. Camp 1 and Camp 13 are listed on the Victorian Heritage Register, which gives them a status of a significant heritage place. And Camp 2, 3 and 4 are listed on official inventories, which in simple terms is a list of known historic sites and relics. Durrangull Mansion is also on the Victorian Heritage Register for historical reasons, as well as its use as the prisoner of war camp during the war years. Some remnants of the camp structures do survive. The other significant places locally that connect this history to the present day are the German War Cemetery at Tatura and the Italian Ossario in Murchison Cemetery, where the remains of German and Italian POWs and internees, respectively, who died while in captivity throughout Australia, have their final resting place. We are fortunate that the Tatura Historical Society has amassed a significant amount of material relating to the camps, and this collection is now listed on the Victorian Heritage Register. In Murchison, we have the von Gruenwald murals and a large collection of his art produced during his time in Camp 13. There is much more that's been recorded about the experience of these people behind the wire and those that guarded them. Fortunately, there are books published some time ago and accounts that are still being published that detail their lives and where you can find the full story about the significant piece of history in the heart of Victoria.